Some say the end of the world is a quiet affair, but for the architect of tomorrow, it began with the sky shattering like cheap glass. She just never expected her lowly bodyguard to be the one to pick up the pieces. Dr. Lyra Vance was the undisputed golden child of the old republic. She was a mind of unparalleled brilliance, the theoretical physicist who mapped the slipstream corridors bridging the stars. She was an idealist through and through, a woman who believed fervently in the power of diplomacy, democratic process, and the bright, equitable future of humanity. Kalen was none of those things. He was a Class 4 security detail, a man whose entire existence was defined by the heavy armor he wore and the kinetic rifle slung across his back. He was barely a statistical blip on the Republic's massive payroll. He stood by the doors of her laboratories, mute and watchful, harboring a quiet, impossible devotion for the woman whose intellect could bend the universe. He never spoke of his feelings. There was absolutely no need. His love was entirely unspoken, written only in the precise way he positioned his body between her and every conceivable angle of threat. Then came the event they would later call the fracture. It was not an act of war, but a cosmic miscalculation. A deep space mining conglomerate pushed an experimental quantum drill too far, piercing a delicate membrane between realities. The dimensional blowback traveled along the established slipstream highways, erupting right into the heart of the Republic's capital world. It was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. Gravity inverted at random. Entire city sectors tore loose from the bedrock, floating up into a burning, multicolored atmosphere before disintegrating. The fundamental laws of physics threw a violent tantrum, and within hours, a civilization that spanned solar systems was brought to its knees by an invisible, bleeding anomaly. Deep in the subterranean depths of her primary research facility, Lyra desperately ran the numbers. The dimensional fallout was a cascading equation. The chaotic energy spilling from the rift would eventually consume the planet, and perhaps the entire sector. The only theoretical way to halt the decay was to synthesize a massive counter-frequency, a monumental computational task requiring her to hardwire her own cerebral cortex directly into the facility's quantum mainframe. To survive the immense neural load without her brain boiling in her skull, she had to go into highly experimental cryogenic stasis. Her plan was simple, desperate, and tragically optimistic. She would sleep. The mainframe would use the processing power of her dreaming mind to crunch the stabilizing algorithms over several years. The Republic's surviving military fleet would organize a rescue, dig through the rubble of the capital, and use her completed data to seal the dimensional rift. She stood before the heavy, frosted glass of the Cryo-Pod. The chaotic destruction of a dying world rumbled through the reinforced concrete above them, shaking dust from the ceiling. She looked at Kalen. His armor was deeply scarred from falling debris, his face bruised and smeared with ash, but his posture remained unbroken. Lyra placed a hand on his chest plate. She told him the process would take 3 years. 5 at the absolute maximum. She gave him one single, definitive command. Hold the door. Keep the facility's geothermal generators online. Keep the scavengers out, and wait for the cavalry to arrive. She stepped into the freezing chamber. The heavy pneumatic doors sealed shut. A thick layer of frost immediately bloomed across the glass, obscuring her face. Kalen checked the battery on his rifle, took his designated position by the reinforced laboratory door, and planted his boots. He waited. 3 years passed. The only sound in the buried bunker was the relentless, rhythmic hum of the cooling units and the distant, muted concussions of tectonic plates tearing themselves apart on the ruined surface. Kalen strictly rationed the facility's emergency supplies. He cleaned and calibrated his weapons every single day. He spent hours just watching the crystalline frost patterns shift on the glass of Lyra's pod. 5 years passed. The cavalry did not arrive. When Kalen tried to tap into the Republic's deep space communication network, the radio frequencies were nothing but a wasteland of static and ghostly screaming dimensional anomalies. Nobody was coming. By year 20, the glorious old Republic was nothing but a graveyard of twisted metal and radioactive ash. The bunker's surface sensors depicted a blasted landscape inhabited only by desperate, starving remnants of humanity who had reverted to barbarism. Kalen's hair turned gray. His joints began to ache with the damp cold of the underground facility. The quiet, passive devotion that had kept him rooted to the floor of the laboratory began to curdle into a terrifying, singular obsession. He had been given an order by the only person who mattered. He would fulfill it. By year 50, the scavengers finally dug deep enough to find the outer airlocks. They came in swarms, wielding plasma torches and crude explosives, desperate for salvage, clean water, and uncorrupted technology. Kalen killed them all. He utilized the bunker's automated defense turrets until they ran out of ammunition. Then he used his rifle until the barrel warped from the heat. And finally, he used a rusted combat knife in the narrow, bloody corridors. He stood amidst the gruesome aftermath in the blast lock, bleeding heavily from a dozen jagged shrapnel wounds, and realized a harsh, mathematical truth. Flesh is fragile. Flesh expires. To keep her alive, he had to stop dying. Kalen left the bunker for the first time in half a century. He ventured out into the toxic wastelands, navigating the anarchic, storm-battered ruins of the old capital. He bartered the stolen weapons of the dead scavengers with black-market genetic weavers and rogue cyber surgeons operating out of irradiated subway tunnels. The modifications started small and practical. A synthetic, heavy-duty lung to filter out the atmospheric ash. A reinforced titanium spinal column to bear the weight of heavier, salvaged military armor. But the threats kept evolving. From the ashes of the scattered survivors, ruthless warlords rose to power, building brutal fiefdoms based on slavery and violence. They heard whispers of a pristine technological treasure buried deep underground, guarded by a solitary, aging madman. They brought small armies. They brought massive siege engines constructed from the hulking scrap of fallen starships. By year 150, Kalen was no longer entirely human. His biological heart had been replaced by a hyper-compressed kinetic pump that never tired. His nervous system was threaded with experimental optic glass, giving his combat reflexes a terrifying, unnatural speed. He had systematically replaced his failing organs and aging limbs with stolen, military-grade hardware, paying for the surgeries with the blood of the warlords he hunted down in the dead of night. Through decades of endless slaughter, Kalen learned a grim tactical lesson. Defending a static position is merely a siege, and history proves that every siege eventually breaks. If he stayed entirely on the defensive, hidden in the dark, someone would eventually get lucky. A stray plasma bolt would penetrate the blast doors and shatter the cryo chamber. A localized earthquake caused by heavy orbital bombardment would rupture the geothermal taps keeping the power on. He realized he could not simply guard the door anymore. He had to clear the threshold. To clear the threshold, he had to pacify the surrounding territory. To control the territory, he needed an army. To command an army, he needed a throne. The quiet bodyguard evolved into a terrifying shadow sweeping across the wasteland. He began systematically dismantling the local raider clans and warlord factions. He did not ask for diplomatic surrender. He offered a simple, brutal choice: kneel and serve the new order, or become ash in the wind. His extensive cybernetic enhancements made him a god of war among desperate men wielding salvaged scraps. He was ruthless, intensely calculating, and entirely devoid of the mercy Lyra had once championed. Yet every single night, no matter how far his bloody campaigns took him across the irradiated plains, he always returned to the subterranean laboratory. He would strip off his heavy armor caked in gore, wash his synthetic steel hands until they shone, and sit down on a simple metal chair beside the humming Cryo-Pod. He would lean close to the frosted glass and speak softly to the woman sleeping inside, telling her about quiet, mundane things. He never once mentioned the slaughter. He told her the toxic weather was finally clearing up. He told her the quantum stabilization algorithms were looking fantastic. He lied to her with a steady, mechanical heart, preserving the pristine image of the benevolent republic she loved, even as he strangled its corpse to forge an empire. Centuries bled together into a blur of conquest and industrialization. The ash eventually settled from the sky. Under his iron grip, a twisted form of order returned to the world. It was a cruel, unforgiving order, built entirely on absolute obedience, surveillance, and fear, but it was highly efficient. To protect the laboratory, he erected a towering, brutalist fortress directly over it, a massive citadel of black steel and harsh red lights that pierced the poisoned clouds. He became a myth to his people, then a tyrant, and finally an undisputed emperor. He ruthlessly centralized all global resources to feed the massive energy requirements of his fortress and his planetary defense grids, leaving the outer provinces in squalor. He crushed any whisper of dissent with a secret police force that moved like phantoms through the night. Every atrocity, every execution, every conquered territory was a calculated mathematical variable to maintain a perimeter of absolute silence and safety around one single frosted glass tube hidden in the deepest, most heavily guarded vault of his palace. Over 500 years, he forgot the original human sound of his own voice. He forgot the taste of real food. He forgot what it felt like to sleep. But he never forgot the exact shade of her eyes. And high above his new global empire, the residual chaotic energies of the fracture still swirled in the upper atmosphere, deep within those shifting dimensional storms. Strange, massive shadows were beginning to coil and writhe against the fabric of reality. Drawn by the scent of a surviving world, the Emperor had locked down the entire planet, building an impregnable cage of steel and guns. But he was painfully aware that the sky above them was a ticking clock. The resurrection protocols of a Mark 7 Cryo-Pod were designed to mimic a gentle sunrise. But after 5 centuries, the thaw felt exactly like being boiled alive in battery acid. Lyra gasped, choking on viscous, gelatinous preservation fluid as the heavy pneumatic seals of her chamber finally gave way. She tumbled forward, expecting to land on the pristine, sanitized white tiles of a Republic medical frigate. She braced herself for the warm, reassuring hands of triage nurses and the crisp, efficient voices of her scientific peers welcoming her back to a saved world. Instead, her bare palms slapped hard against freezing, polished obsidian. The air did not smell of ozone and sterile bandages. It smelled of recycled industrial exhaust, ancient dust, and the sharp metallic tang of blood long since scrubbed away. She coughed violently, dragging stale oxygen into lungs that had not expanded in half a millennium. Her vision blurred, swimming with dark spots before slowly resolving into towering, monstrous vertical lines. She was not in a hospital. She was on the floor of a cavernous, cathedral-like vault that defied the engineering aesthetics of the world she knew. Immense pillars of black steel stretched up into a ceiling completely swallowed by absolute darkness. The only illumination came from a series of dim, blood-red luminescent strips running along the floorboards. Every surface around her was brutal, angular, and deliberately designed to intimidate. This was architecture weaponized to make the observer feel entirely insignificant and profoundly unwelcome. Lyra pushed herself up on trembling legs, clutching her thin, dripping stasis suit against her chest. Her brilliant mind raced, desperately attempting to map the variables of her current situation. The old Republic would never sanction the construction of something so grotesquely oppressive. This was the fortress of a conqueror. Had the dimensional stabilization failed, had a rogue faction seized control of the capital's ruins. The rhythmic, earth-shaking thud of footsteps echoed from the impenetrable shadows ahead. It was not the crisp, synchronized marching cadence of a Republic Marine unit. It was the crushing, mechanical stride of a heavy siege engine. A figure emerged from the gloom, flanked by a dozen silent, heavily armed guards wearing featureless obsidian armor. But the guards were entirely negligible compared to the giant they escorted. The man leading the formation stood over 7 feet tall, draped in a massive, sweeping cloak of spun carbon fiber that seemed to devour the red light of the vault. His body was a terrifying, asymmetrical fusion of heavily scarred biological muscle and matte black cybernetic plating. A heavy respirator unit hummed softly beneath the thick collar of his armor, glowing with a faint, chilling blue luminescence. He possessed the suffocating aura of a man who had not simply conquered a planet, but had personally beaten it to death and meticulously rebuilt it from the shattered bones. Lyra stood her ground, forcing her trembling spine rigidly straight. She was an idealist, but she was never a coward. She summoned the full, commanding authority of a chief scientific officer of the old Republic, an authority she fully expected this warlord to recognize. She loudly demanded to know the current stellar date, the operational status of the quantum stabilization mainframe, and the immediate location of the nearest Democratic Planetary Council. The towering figure stopped a few paces away. For a long, suffocating moment, the massive vault was consumed by absolute silence. Then, a harsh, grating sound erupted from deep within the giant's chest. It took Lyra a full second to realize it was laughter. It was a dry, rusted, mechanical sound, as if the very concept of amusement was a foreign file his internal processors struggled to run. He spoke, and his voice was a deep, synthetic rumble that vibrated right through the obsidian floor and rattled the teeth in her skull. He informed her that asking for a democratic planetary council in this era was precisely like asking for a mythical beast to fetch her slippers. He noted with a dry, dark amusement that the glorious republic she so fiercely championed was currently acting as a highly compressed layer of radioactive fertilizer across the entire southern hemisphere. Lyra felt a physical spike of cold horror pierce her chest. She argued back furiously, her voice echoing in the massive chamber. She insisted that the stabilization algorithm she had calculated during her sleep must have reached the fleet. She demanded to speak to the sovereign authority of whatever rogue colony had dared to salvage her pod without following proper Republic protocol. The giant tilted his massive head. The hydraulic servos in his reinforced neck whined softly in the quiet. He stepped forward, leaving his guards behind, and entered the dim pool of red light cast by her open Cryo-Pod. "I am the sovereign authority," he stated flatly. "I am the emperor of the soulless dominion, the architect of the Iron Peace, and the only mathematical reason you currently have air in your lungs." Lyra stared up at him, defiance burning hot in her chest, but the angry words died instantly in her throat as the light finally illuminated his face. The lower half of his jaw was completely synthetic, a brutalist cage of reinforced steel housing vocal synthesizers. His left eye was a glowing artificial crimson targeting lens that whirred as it constantly adjusted focus. But his right eye remained biologically human. It was a painfully familiar, striking shade of hazel. It was an eye deeply weathered by unimaginable stretches of time, carrying a weight of exhaustion so profound it defied human comprehension. That single human eye was looking down at her not with the cold, calculating malice of a tyrannical warlord, but with an agonizing, desperate relief. Lyra's breath hitched. Her scientific mind, trained to observe the most minute details of the physical universe, began to frantically connect impossible data points. She looked at the specific way he held his left shoulder just a fraction of an inch lower than his right. A phantom posture developed from carrying a heavy kinetic rifle on long patrols. She noticed the incredibly delicate, precise way his massive, terrifying metal fingers twitched at his sides, as if fighting a violent internal war against the urge to reach out and touch her face. She saw the familiar faint scar cutting through his eyebrow, a souvenir from a training accident decades before the sky tore open. The brilliant physicist, a woman who could calculate the gravitational spin of a dying star entirely in her head, felt her entire reality completely and violently collapse. "Kalen," she whispered. The Emperor did not move. He did not confirm it with words. He merely stood there, a monstrous monument of violence built entirely to guard a ghost. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of 500 years of slaughter, survival, and a devotion that had warped into a planetary nightmare. Before Lyra could process the terrifying reality of what her gentle protector had become, a sudden, frantic blaring of alarm sirens shattered the quiet of the vault. The red lighting shifted to a blinding, strobing yellow. An automated voice echoed from the ceiling, signaling a catastrophic breach in the upper atmospheric defense grid. Something massive had just forcefully entered the planet's airspace, and it was radiating an energy signature that matched the dimensional tear that had destroyed her world half a millennium ago. A prison built from silk and hyper-titanium is still a cage, especially when the warden is the man who once pledged his life to protect your freedom. Lyra found herself sequestered in the highest spire of the Emperor's central citadel, confined to a suite that was a grotesque parody of luxury. The floors were lined with synthetic furs of extinct beasts, and the furniture was carved from the petrified wood of a long-dead forest. Yet the doors were secured by biometric locks thick enough to withstand a tactical nuclear strike. She walked to the massive reinforced plasteel window and looked down upon the capital of the Solace Dominion. It was a machine of staggering, horrifying efficiency. Gone were the lush, terraced gardens and the open-air democratic forums of the old republic. Below her stretched an endless ocean of jagged black architecture, illuminated by the harsh, bleeding glow of neon propaganda and industrial furnaces. Millions of citizens moved through the lower transit grids in perfect, terrifying synchrony, their heads bowed beneath the weight of absolute surveillance. Suddenly, a minor disturbance broke the flow of the crowd. Through the enhanced magnification of the window pane, Lyra watched as a squad of the Emperor's secret police materialized from the shadows. They wore optical camouflage that bent the polluted light around them, making them look like humanoid voids. In a matter of seconds, they silently dragged a dissenting citizen into an armored transport, leaving no trace behind but a dropped ration tin. The crowd did not panic. They simply closed the gap and kept walking. The cold realization washed over Lyra like ice water. Kalen had not just survived the apocalypse, he had weaponized it, sterilizing humanity of its chaotic variables to forge a perfect, obedient clockwork society. While Lyra stared at the grim reality of her new world, a far more insidious threat was taking root deep within the subterranean war rooms of the palace. The Imperial Council, a cabal of ruthless military governors and hyper-wealthy industrial barons who profited from Kalen's iron rule, were gathered in a chamber of polished obsidian. They wore sharp, geometric robes designed to intimidate, their bodies heavily augmented with cognitive processors and silver cranial plating. At the head of the obsidian table stood Lord Vane, the Dominion's Minister of Intelligence. His jawline was completely replaced by a smooth, gunmetal chassis. Vane pulled up a holographic projection of the recent atmospheric breach. He pointed a long, synthetic finger at the data stream. The anomaly had torn through the outer defense grid, radiating an energy signature that defied known physics. Yet the Emperor had completely halted the orbital bombardment protocols. Instead of leading the planetary defense fleet, the architect of the Iron Peace had personally abandoned his command post to escort a single biological relic from the lower vaults to the Council. This was mathematically unacceptable. The Emperor was the central pillar of the Dominion. He was a creature of pure, calculating violence, a flawless machine of governance. This woman from the past was a virus in his code. She represented sentimentality, weakness, and distraction at the exact moment a cosmic threat was clawing its way through the sky. Vane lowered his voice to a digitized whisper, proposing a chillingly pragmatic solution. They could not openly defy the Emperor, but they could prune the weakness from his heart. A specialized, untraceable hunter drone was quietly activated, authorized to bypass the palace's internal security net by piggybacking on the automated cleaning subroutines. Its target was the guest in the upper spire. Back in the gilded cage, the heavy blast doors of Lyra's suite hissed open. Kalen stepped into the room. He had removed his heavy carbon fiber combat mantle, revealing the full extent of his cybernetic reconstruction. Matte black armor plating was fused directly to his spine and ribs. He looked less like a man and more like a walking weapon of mass destruction. Yet he moved with a quiet, careful hesitation, as if terrified his sheer mass might break the air around her. Lyra turned from the window, her eyes blazing with a righteous centuries-old fury. She did not shrink back. She marched straight up to the towering cyborg, stopping mere inches from his reinforced chest plate. She demanded to know what he had done. She asked where the courts of justice were, where the planetary senate was hiding, and how he could possibly justify transforming the vibrant, diverse survivors of humanity into a horde of terrified, mechanized slaves. She threw his own history in his face, reminding him of the gentle, honorable guard who used to share his rations with the street orphans of the lower levels. Kalen absorbed her verbal assault without flinching, his single human eye locked onto hers, burning with an exhaustion that made Lyra's heart ache in spite of her anger. When he finally spoke, his synthetic voice was low, carrying the undeniable weight of countless massacres. He explained that the republic she mourned had died the exact moment the sky shattered. He told her a bitterly dark, humorous story about the early days of the collapse, when he had tried to hold a civilized, democratic vote over who should receive the last functional water purifier in a refugee camp. The vote had ended with 30 people butchered by raiders and the purifier destroyed in the crossfire. He leaned down, his mechanized breath washing over her face. He told her that democracy is a luxury of a safe world. In a dying universe, morality does not feed starving children, and voting does not stop a warlord's plasma blade. Only iron stops the blade. Lyra felt tears welling in her eyes, a mixture of profound sorrow and desperate frustration. She told him that surviving without freedom was not life at all. She accused him of becoming the very monster they used to fight. Kalen's metallic jaw tightened. He did not deny the accusation. He readily admitted he had bathed in oceans of blood. He had executed thousands, conquered continents, and crushed every spark of rebellion under his titanium heel. But he did it so the geothermal taps powering her pod would never flicker. He became a monster precisely so she would not have to wake up in a universe populated by them. He then pointed a massive armored finger toward the ceiling, referencing the blaring alarms that had interrupted her awakening. He told her the anomaly was not a random stellar event. It was a predator. The fracture was a doorway, and something unimaginably ancient and hostile was currently trying to squeeze through it. He had built this entire brutal empire, forged this vast military machine for one singular purpose. He needed absolute, unquestioning control of the entire planet's resources to build a shield. strong enough to repel the incoming storm. The romantic tension between them was a suffocating, almost tangible force in the room, deeply entangled with their vicious ideological warfare. He was a tyrant. She was a champion of liberty. Yet, the unbreakable bond of their shared past pulsed beneath the anger. He reached out, his lethal mechanized fingers stopping a hair's breadth from wiping a tear from her cheek, fully aware his touch was now made of cold, unyielding steel. He ordered her to stay away from the windows and turned to leave, marching back to the war room to face the nightmare tearing through the upper atmosphere. The heavy blast doors sealed shut behind him with a definitive, ringing thud, plunging the suite back into a tense silence. Lyra stood alone in the center of the vast room, the echoes of their bitter argument ringing in her ears. She wiped her face, her brilliant analytical mind refusing to simply accept her captivity. If Kalen had become the villain to save the world, she needed to understand the mechanics of his empire to save him from himself. She walked over to the ancient petrified wood desk, looking for any terminal or data port she could slice into. As she ran her hand along the edge of the desk, she failed to notice the subtle, microscopic shifting of the shadows near the ventilation grate above her. A nearly invisible, multi-legged drone constructed from programmable glass slipped silently from the ductwork. It clung to the ceiling, its venomous payload ready, waiting for the perfect angle to strike the Emperor's only weakness while the rest of the palace looked at the burning sky. The difference between a madman and a messiah is often just the quality of their public relations. And the Emperor had 500 years to perfect his. But the pristine, heavily guarded silence of his private sanctuary told a vastly different story. High in the upper spire, the glass assassin drone dropped from the ventilation grate with lethal, calculated precision. Its multi-jointed legs extended, aiming a micro-syringe filled with synthetic neurotoxin directly at Lyra's exposed neck as she leaned over the petrified wood desk. The machine was a masterpiece of untraceable, silent death. It never reached her skin. A localized defense matrix, woven invisibly into the very fabric of the suite by a profoundly paranoid ruler, snapped into existence the microsecond a foreign velocity breached the perimeter. The drone collided with the invisible kinetic barrier and instantly vaporized into a cloud of harmless, glowing ash. Before Lyra could even process the sudden flash of intense heat, the architectural geometry of the suite violently shifted. A heavy obsidian wall panel slammed aside, revealing a dimly lit, narrow maintenance corridor. The suite's automated emergency protocols were funneling the high-value target to a secondary safe room, away from the compromised airspace, miles below, in the subterranean depths of the Imperial War Room. Kalen was delivering his own brand of absolute security. He stood over the shattered, sparking remains of a holographic tactical table. Governor Thorne, a man who had secretly voted to defund the Eastern Orbital Defense Grid to line his own pockets, was currently pinned against the steel bulkhead by the Emperor's massive, mechanized hand. Kalen did not shout. He did not lose his temper. He spoke in a flat, synthesized whisper that froze the blood of every heavily augmented council member present in the chamber. He methodically explained the mathematical cost of Thorne's greed in the face of the cosmic anomaly currently tearing through their upper atmosphere. He detailed the exact number of civilian casualties that would result from the compromised grid. Then, with a casual, terrifyingly effortless flex of his hydraulic servos, Kalen crushed the governor's reinforced throat. He dropped the lifeless body to the floor and turned his glowing crimson targeting lens back to the surviving ministers, demanding a new tactical projection. As Lyra hurried down the hidden spiraling staircase inside the walls of the spire, her mind involuntarily flashed to a rainy afternoon half a millennium ago. She remembered Kalen, completely off duty, kneeling in the mud outside the old Republic Senate building. He had spent an hour carefully splinting the broken leg of a stray street hound. his large, calloused hands moving with shocking, unexpected tenderness. He had wrapped the shivering animal in his own uniform jacket. The terrifying metallic dictator currently ruling a galaxy with an iron fist was built from the exact same flesh and bone. The cognitive dissonance made her chest ache with a profound, suffocating sorrow. She reached the bottom of the long staircase and stepped through a thick, hissing blast door. The breath completely left her lungs. She was no longer standing in a brutalist, dystopian palace. She was standing inside a perfect, immaculate replica of her old Republic laboratory. The lighting was tuned to the exact warm, golden spectrum she always preferred when working late. Her old theoretical equations were scrawled meticulously across a digital whiteboard, completely frozen in time. A ceramic mug, identically chipped on the left side, sat beside a neat stack of physical data slates. The air smelled faintly of ozone and old paper. He had built a secret dust-free shrine to a dead world deep within the heart of his nightmare empire, just to remember who he was protecting. Lyra approached the central terminal. The interface was an archaic Republic design, untouched by the brutalist aesthetics of the Dominion. It was unlocked. She accessed the primary directory and found a single massive data folder labeled simply with her name. It contained 500 years of daily audio and text logs. She sat in the worn leather chair and began to read. For the next hour, she watched the agonizing, incremental erosion of a good man's soul. The early entries were filled with fear and desperate loneliness. Kalen spoke of the biting cold, the dwindling rations, and his terror of failing her. Then came the cold, calculated shift. She read the exact day he realized that playing defense was mathematically flawed. To secure the geothermal taps powering her pod, he had to pacify the chaotic ruins of the Northern Hemisphere. To pacify the hemisphere, he needed an army of ruthless killers. To feed that army, he had to conquer the agricultural sectors of the southern continent, subjugating millions. To build the heavy armor necessary to protect the ever-expanding perimeter, he had to violently enslave the mining guilds of the outer moons. Every single atrocity, every shattered rebellion, every drop of blood spilled across the solar system was meticulously categorized in his logs as a logistical necessity to keep her vital signs stable. He never wanted a throne. He only wanted a shield. The entire Solus Dominion, with its secret police, its towering black citadels, and its terrified populace, was a colossal monument to one man's terrifying, uncompromising devotion. She was the epicenter of a galactic nightmare. The heavy, crushing moral weight of billions of enslaved lives fell squarely onto her shoulders. A soft, unexpected chime interrupted her devastating revelation. A secondary door, disguised flawlessly as a supply closet in the corner of the lab, hissed open. Lyra shot to her feet, bracing for the arrival of the Emperor's obsidian-armored guards. Instead, a lone palace servant stepped inside. He wore the drab, featureless gray robes of the lowest caste, his head bowed in the mandatory, deeply ingrained posture of total submission. But as the door sealed behind him, he looked up, and his eyes were completely free of the terror that saturated every other citizen of the Citadel. He moved with a practiced, silent speed, casually bypassing the room's secondary biometric scanners with a smuggled, heavy-duty access key. He approached Lyra, glancing nervously at the security cameras he had temporarily looped with a localized scrambling field. He quickly pressed a small, cold, metallic cylinder into her palm. It was a crude, unregulated communication device, cobbled together from black market tech and entirely severed from the Imperial surveillance grid. The servant leaned in and whispered a string of encrypted coordinates. He told her the Vanguard of the Dawn was waiting in the lower sublevels, and they possessed the schematic flaws required to drop the palace's internal energy shields. He warned her that the Imperial Council had already voted on her assassination, and the drone in her suite was merely the first move in a much larger political coup. Before Lyra could ask who the Vanguard were, or how a lowly servant possessed the codes to the Emperor's most sacred hidden vault, the man slipped back into the hidden passage, leaving no trace of his presence. Lyra stood alone in the perfect replica of her past, clutching a piece of high treason in her hand. She was fully aware that if Kalen discovered the Council had actively tried to murder her in her sleep, his resulting wrath would likely tear the entire capital city down to its bedrock. A fortress engineered to keep an entire hostile universe at bay is inherently flawless at keeping a single, fragile prisoner trapped inside. But the grand architect of that obsidian cage had fundamentally underestimated the brilliant woman who originally taught him the mathematics of a locked door. Lyra did not panic. She calculated. The metallic cylinder the servant pressed into her palm was crude, but the encrypted frequency it emitted provided a microscopic back door into the palace subrouting network. She immediately recognized a glaring, arrogant flaw in Kalen's design. He had built his sprawling dystopian citadel directly on top of her original Old Republic laboratory, incorporating its ancient mainframe into the very foundation of his new empire. He had upgraded the armor, multiplied the lethality, and coated it all in black steel. But the underlying digital bones still belonged to her. She plugged the device into her archaic terminal. Her fingers flew across the worn keys, resurrecting command prompts that had lain dormant for 5 centuries. She did not hack the formidable Imperial system. She simply reminded the security grid who its true mother was. The biometric alarms instantly went completely deaf to her vital signs. The heavy blast doors of the hidden sanctuary hissed open without a single siren, granting her unfettered access to the labyrinthine ventilation shafts that plunged into the subterranean guts of the capital. She climbed down into the abyss for what felt like hours. The pristine, petrified wood luxury of the upper spires rapidly dissolved into a suffocating, industrialized hellscape. The temperature spiked. The air grew thick with the acrid stench of burning promethium, cheap ozone, and the collective sweat of 1 million indentured laborers. She dropped from a rusted iron grating into a narrow, neon-drenched alleyway in the lowest transit sector. The towering structures above blocked out all natural light, replacing the sky with a suffocating ceiling of tangled pipes and humming power cables. The coordinates led her to a heavy, unmarked blast door hidden behind a roaring plasma refinery exhaust vent. The door wrenched open a fraction of a second before she could knock. Rough, desperate hands pulled her violently into the shadows. She found herself in a damp, concrete bunker surrounded by heavily scarred, desperately thin fighters. They wore patched, scavenged military gear and gripped jury-rigged kinetic rifles with white-knuckled intensity. These were the Vanguard of the Dawn. The moment their leader, a grizzled woman sporting a brutal mechanical prosthetic jaw, scanned Lyra's unblemished face and recognized the archaic, pristine cut of her stasis suit, the entire room froze. Then, one by one, they dropped to their knees. They did not see a terrified, displaced theoretical physicist. They saw a messianic figure stepping out of a forgotten myth. To them, she was the sleeping saint of the Republic, the living, breathing embodiment of the golden age they had bled and died attempting to restore. There was absolutely no time for religious reverence. The Imperial security net had finally registered the phantom ghost moving through its code. The narrow alleyway outside erupted with the deafening roar of military-grade repulsor engines. Imperial stalker drones, sleek, metallic arachnids armed with rapid-fire plasma casters, swarmed the perimeter. They tore through the exhaust vents with terrifying mechanical efficiency. Lyra was thrust instantly into a frantic, high-octane firefight. The rebels dragged her through a chaotic, disorienting maze of flooded subterranean markets and sparking maintenance tunnels. Blinding bolts of superheated plasma shattered the concrete pillars around them, turning the air to fire. Lyra refused to cower. Her brilliant mind processed the tactical geometry of the skirmish in milliseconds. She barked sharp, precise orders, directing the rebel crossfire to exploit the microsecond delays in the drone's targeting sensors, a foundational flaw inherent to the original Republic algorithms Kalen had repurposed. With her hyper-calculated guidance, the Vanguard turned the narrow transit corridors into a lethal bottleneck, reducing the terrifying Imperial machines to heaps of smoking, sparking slag. They finally reached a deeply buried, secure redoubt within the lowest foundation strata, as the rebel medics desperately tended to their wounded comrades. The leader unrolled a flickering holographic schematic of the Imperial palace above. She enthusiastically explained their ultimate masterstroke, with Lyra finally present to bypass the highest-level encryption algorithms. The Vanguard planned to manually overload the Citadel's primary geothermal conduit. The resulting subterranean explosion would permanently cripple the Emperor's internal defense grid, leaving his throne room completely exposed to a full-scale, bloody uprising. Lyra stared at the glowing blue lines of the projection, her blood turning to absolute ice. She ran the thermodynamic equations in her head instantly. She pointed a trembling finger at the densely populated worker sectors located directly adjacent to the main conduit. She fiercely informed the rebel leader that a thermal overload of that specific magnitude would instantly vaporize 3 surrounding civilian districts, incinerating upwards of 50,000 innocent people in a fraction of a second. The rebel leader did not flinch. She coldly and flatly stated that absolute freedom required a bloody toll, and 50,000 lives was a mathematically acceptable sacrifice to finally tear the tyrant off his throne. She argued forcefully that the Emperor casually killed that many citizens in a single month of missed industrial quotas. Lyra stumbled back, deeply nauseated by the horrific, twisted symmetry of the argument. The Vanguard of the Dawn were not noble heroes fighting a monster. They were simply a different breed of monster, entirely willing to slaughter the very people they claimed to liberate, all in the name of an abstract, blood-soaked ideal. She had escaped the gilded cage of a mass murderer only to find herself arming a desperate, ruthless terrorist cell. She realized with crushing clarity that the pure, highly moral universe she had left behind in the Cryo-Pod simply did not exist anymore. She was trapped in a crushing moral vice between total security built on tyranny and absolute freedom built on mass murder. As Lyra stood paralyzed by the agonizing weight of her situation, the rebel bunker's crude seismic sensors began to chime frantically. The concrete ground beneath their feet trembled with a rhythmic, catastrophic force. It was not another wave of automated lightweight drones. Something immeasurably heavier, something wielding the personalized, earth-shattering footfalls of an enraged god, had just violently breached the outer blast doors, and it was walking directly toward them. The terrifying truth about building an impenetrable fortress is that the architect also knows exactly how to tear it down. He never actually lost her. He was merely waiting to see how far into the dark she was willing to run before the shadows bit back. The reinforced blast doors of the rebel bunker did not simply open, nor did they shatter. They buckled inward violently, warping like wet paper under an application of sheer, unimaginable kinetic force before being ripped entirely off their heavy steel hinges. A suffocating cloud of pulverized concrete rolled into the room, accompanied by the heavy rhythmic thud of armored footsteps that Lyra knew intimately well. The Vanguard of the Dawn reacted with the desperate fury of cornered animals. A dozen jury-rigged kinetic rifles and stolen plasma casters leveled at the breach, unleashing a blinding torrent of superheated death into the smoke. For 10 agonizing seconds, the bunker was a storm of lethal energy. Then, the smoke parted, dragged violently aside by a localized magnetic displacement field. The Emperor stood completely unharmed in the center of the kill zone. His sweeping carbon fiber mantle was barely singed. The glowing crimson targeting lens replacing his left eye whirred softly, instantly analyzing the trajectory of every fired weapon and mapping the biometric signatures of every rebel in the room. He did not even bother to unholster the massive brutalist hand cannon strapped to his armored thigh. He simply moved. To Lyra's highly trained, observant eyes, the violence was almost mathematical in its terrifying perfection. Kalen closed the distance across the bunker with a predatory speed that defied his immense metallic bulk. He did not engage in a slaughter. He executed a surgical dismantling of the threat. A flick of his reinforced wrist shattered a rebel's rifle. A calculated palm strike to a chest plate dropped another fighter into immediate unconsciousness. He waded through the frantic crossfire like a man walking through a light drizzle, systematically disarming and incapacitating the Vanguard's fiercest warriors in a matter of heartbeats. The grizzled rebel leader with the mechanical jaw raised her weapon for a point-blank shot, but Kalen's massive mechanized hand closed completely over the barrel. The heat of the plasma charge safely detonated inside his titanium grip, venting harmlessly through his armor joints. With a casual, almost insulting flick of his wrist, he tossed the ruined weapon aside and pinned the rebel leader to the concrete floor, his heavy boot resting lightly but firmly against her throat. Lyra threw herself forward, putting her fragile biological body directly between the towering cyborg and the defeated rebels. She screamed at him to stop, bracing for the inevitable, bloody execution of the entire cell. Kalen froze. His human eye, carrying the weight of 5 centuries of exhaustion, looked down at her. The hydraulic servos in his neck whined as he tilted his head, completely ignoring the groaning, incapacitated fighters scattered around them. He told her, in a voice that rumbled like shifting tectonic plates, that he had actively monitored her localized data breach the exact second she plugged the stolen communication device into the archaic terminal. He explained that his security grid was entirely flawless, and a backdoor only exists if the creator deliberately leaves the hinges unoiled. He had let her escape. He had let her navigate the grimy, terrifying underbelly of his empire, and he had let her meet the supposed heroes of the resistance. He leaned down, his synthetic breath washing over the rebel leader pinned beneath his boot. He commanded Lyra to look closely at the saviors she had chosen. He demanded she recount the thermal overload schematic she had just witnessed, forcing her to verbally admit that these noble freedom fighters were perfectly willing to incinerate 50,000 innocent civilians just to scratch the paint on his throne room floor. Lyra swallowed hard, the sickening truth paralyzing her vocal cords. She could not deny it. He had purposely guided her into the hands of the wolves so she could see the stark, horrific reality of the universe outside her preserved memories. Yet, to her profound shock, Kalen lifted his boot. He did not crush the rebel leader's throat as he had done to the treacherous governor hours before. Instead, he signaled to the squad of obsidian-armored guards who had silently filed into the ruined bunker behind him. He ordered them to bind the rebel leader and her top lieutenants, but specifically commanded that no vital organs were to be punctured. He then turned his towering frame toward Lyra and offered his massive, heavily scarred hand. He informed her that the philosophical debate regarding tyranny and freedom was officially suspended. The ticking clock she had successfully ignored for 500 years had finally struck midnight. Within minutes, the prisoners and the displaced physicist were loaded into a heavily armored, hypervelocity extraction shuttle. They did not return to the gilded cage in the upper spires, nor did they descend to the obsidian war room where the Imperial Council was currently whispering treasonous plots in his absence. The shuttle shot vertically up the central spine of the citadel, breaking through the toxic cloud cover and entering the desolate vacuum of the upper stratosphere. They docked seamlessly with the Emperor's personal command dreadnought, a leviathan of black steel and bristling weapon batteries that hung over the capital city like a dark moon. Lyra was marched onto the primary bridge, a vast cavernous amphitheater of tactical displays and frantic military personnel. Kalen dragged the chained rebel leader up to the massive reinforced plasteel viewport that dominated the front of the bridge. He ordered Lyra to stand beside them. He pointed a heavy armored finger out into the void of space. The sky above the Solace Dominion was bleeding. The strange phenomenon that had triggered the planetary alarms was no longer a theoretical energy signature. It was a physical, terrifying reality. The fabric of space-time was tearing open, ripping apart in a jagged, violent wound of swirling purple and sickly green luminescence. It was the fracture, the exact same dimensional anomaly that had shattered the old Republic. But its scale was magnified 1,000-fold, and something was moving inside it. Lyra pressed her hands against the cold glass, her brilliant mind struggling to categorize the cosmic horror unfolding before her. It defied Euclidean geometry. It was a shifting, writhing mass of impossible angles and predatory, abyssal shadows, bleeding through the rift like an infection entering a bloodstream. It was not a mindless storm of dimensional energy. It possessed a distinct, suffocating psychic weight. It was an apex predator from a realm outside of established physics, and it was looking directly at their world with starving intent. Kalen stepped up right behind Lyra. He explained that he had monitored the microscopic tremors in the dimensional membrane for 3 centuries. He knew the rift was healing incorrectly. He knew that the chaotic energy she had sought to stabilize had merely acted as a beacon, drawing something ancient and hungry from the dark between realities. He gestured expansively to the massive, heavily armed dreadnoughts surrounding them, and down to the glowing planetary defense grid shielding the world below. He stated with brutal clarity that his entire reign of terror, the forced labor camps, the ruthless centralization of resources, and the terrified, obedient populace were never truly about maintaining political power. You do not build a fortress of this magnitude to keep desperate, starving scavengers at bay. He had spent 500 years turning humanity into a single, hardened, unbreakable sword. He had forged a brutal, unfeeling military machine designed exclusively to act as a planetary meat shield against an impending extinction-level event. The Solace Dominion was not an empire. It was a trench. He looked down at the rebel leader, who was now staring at the cosmic anomaly with a look of absolute, soul-crushing terror. Her revolutionary zeal instantly evaporating in the face of a true godlike threat. Kalen flatly told her that if she had succeeded in dropping the planetary shields to overthrow his throne, the alien intelligence bleeding through the rift would have consumed the entire biosphere in a matter of hours. The staggering, horrifying scale of Kalen's burden crashed down upon Lyra. He had chosen to become the devil so humanity could survive meeting a demon. But as the anomaly widened, threatening to swallow the orbital defense platforms, Lyra realized that even an empire built on 5 centuries of concentrated suffering might not possess the firepower to kill a nightmare of that magnitude. Furthermore, deep in the subterranean war room far below, the Imperial Council remained entirely unaware of the true threat, convinced that their emperor's distraction with a relic of the past was the perfect opening to slide a knife firmly into his cybernetic back. A throne forged entirely from fear is only as secure as the terror it commands. And terror is a highly flammable substance when the sky itself begins to burn. The colossal viewport of the Dreadnought's primary bridge offered a front-row seat to the end of the universe. But the true threat did not come from the bleeding anomaly outside the glass. It came from the shadows within. Without a single warning siren, the bridge's crimson tactical illumination snapped to a dead, sickly green. The massive holographic projection of the planetary defense grid abruptly vanished, replaced by the towering, digitized visage of Lord Vane. The Minister of Intelligence stared down from the projector, his smooth gunmetal jaw reflecting the cold light. He did not address the Emperor. He addressed the heavily augmented bridge crew and the elite Obsidian guards stationed at every exit. Vane declared that the architect of the Iron Peace had finally succumbed to biological degradation. He pointed a synthetic finger at Lyra, proclaiming her a cognitive virus that had corrupted their absolute ruler. The Imperial Council, blind to the true predatory nature of the cosmic anomaly, had unanimously voted to seize control. They intended to lower the planetary defense grid to conserve power, believing the fracture was merely a natural energy storm to be weathered, not a gateway for an apex predator. The execution order was broadcasted directly into the neural implants of every loyalist guard on the ship. The bridge instantly descended into absolute, deafening chaos. Kalen did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. Before the first mutinous guard could even level their plasma caster, the Emperor moved. He tackled Lyra, wrapping his massive carbon fiber-plated body around hers, and threw them both behind the heavy plasteel bulkhead of the central command console. The air where they had stood just a millisecond prior instantly superheated, flashing bright white as a dozen high-yield plasma bolts melted the metal decking into glowing slag. The quiet, stoic bodyguard of the old Republic was entirely gone. In his place was a terrifying engine of war. Kalen rose from behind the console, his heavy hand cannon roaring to life. He did not fire wildly. His glowing crimson targeting lens whirred, calculating vectors and armor weaknesses in real time. He fired 3 times, a rapid, deafening staccato that shattered the reinforced chest plates of the 3 closest mutineers, throwing their heavy bodies backward into the advancing squad. He vaulted over the console with shocking agility for a man built of dense titanium, crashing directly into the enemy line. He became a blur of brutal, mechanized violence, crushing reinforced helmets with palm strikes and snapping synthetic limbs with effortless hydraulic power. But Lyra was not a damsel waiting to be rescued in the crossfire. She was the most brilliant theoretical physicist humanity had ever produced, and she recognized immediately that Kalen's sheer kinetic force could not outlast an entire dreadnought of elite assassins. She dropped to her knees behind the console, her hands flying across the dormant manual overrides beneath the primary tactical interface. The mutineers possessed military-grade cybernetics, but they were operating on an infrastructure she had fundamentally designed 5 centuries ago. She did not need a weapon. The ship itself was a weapon. A squad of heavily armed traitors rushed the left flank, preparing to catch Kalen in a devastating crossfire. Lyra's fingers danced across the holographic keys. She isolated the artificial gravity plating beneath that specific sector of the bridge and completely inverted the polarity. The heavily armored squad screamed as they were violently ripped from the floor and slammed into the high ceiling with bone-shattering force. She swiftly locked the gravity field in place, leaving them pinned and neutralized. Kalen noticed the tactical shift instantly. He did not need to look back to know what she was doing. A flawless, lethal synergy erupted between them. They fought back to back against the rising tide of treason. He was the unstoppable kinetic spear. She was the invisible digital shield. As Kalen tore through the physical barricades, Lyra sealed heavy blast doors to cut off enemy reinforcements, when a heavy weapons platform swiveled to target the Emperor. Lyra hacked the localized targeting subroutines, forcing the automated turrets to unleash their payload into the ranks of the mutinous council guards. The bridge was a nightmare of smoke, searing light, and the stench of burning ozone. Kalen grabbed the last standing mutineer on the command deck, lifting the heavily armored man entirely off his feet by the throat, and hurled him through a secondary glass partition. The immediate threat was neutralized, but the dreadnought's internal alarm screamed that thousands of reinforcements were currently breaching the lower decks. Kalen grabbed Lyra's arm, his metallic grip surprisingly gentle, and pulled her into a narrow, heavily shielded auxiliary command corridor situated directly behind the main bridge. He punched the manual override, and the thick titanium blast doors slammed shut, locking into place with a heavy, definitive thud. They were granted a terrifyingly brief reprieve. The narrow corridor was bathed in the dim amber light of emergency power. Kalen leaned heavily against the cold steel bulkhead. He was venting heat rapidly, his internal cooling fans whining at maximum capacity. A dark, viscous synthetic fluid leaked from a jagged plasma scorch on his shoulder, exposing a tangle of frayed, sparking optic wires. Lyra did not step back from the terrifying cyborg. She stepped closer. She tore a long strip of pristine thermal fabric from the sleeve of her stasis suit and reached up, her hands working quickly to bind the damaged wiring in his shoulder to prevent a localized short circuit. The silence between them was heavier than the titanium doors keeping the mutineers at bay. They were inches apart. The scent of ozone, blood, and burnt metal hung thick in the air. She looked up from his wounded shoulder, her eyes locking directly onto his single biological hazel eye. She spoke softly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She told him that the gentleman who used to stand outside her laboratory was truly gone. He had been entirely consumed by the tyrant, buried beneath centuries of necessary slaughter and unforgiving steel. Kalen's mechanized jaw tightened. He looked down at her, his expression a mask of profound sorrow. His synthetic voice was a low, grating rasp as he agreed. He confessed that he had traded his humanity, his morality and his soul for the absolute certainty that she would wake up breathing. He stated that he was a monster, and he fully accepted the damnation that came with the title. Lyra shook her head slowly. Her hands rested against the cold, matte black armor of his chest plate. She felt the heavy, relentless thumping of the hyper-compressed kinetic pump that served as his heart. She told him he was entirely wrong. The core of him, the desperate, unyielding devotion that defined his very existence, had never changed. It had simply expanded to horrifying planetary proportions. He was a monster, she agreed, but he was her monster. The intense, bitter ideological war they had waged since she stepped out of the Cryo-Pod completely dissolved in the amber light of the corridor. The profound tragedy of their 500-year separation hung over them. But the unbreakable bond forged in the ashes of the old republic pulsed brilliantly beneath it. Kalen slowly raised his massive, lethal hand. He hesitated, the hydraulic servos in his fingers trembling slightly, before gently resting his cold metallic palm against her warm cheek. It was a gesture of profound vulnerability from a man who had conquered a solar system. They stood together in the eye of the storm, finally acknowledging the terrifying truth of their shared existence. But the universe rarely grants peace to those who defy it. The tender, suspended moment violently shattered. The entire dreadnought suddenly shuddered with a catastrophic, earth-shattering force that threw them both hard against the opposite bulkhead. The amber emergency lights flickered and died, plunging the corridor into total darkness. The reinforced titanium doors were not buckling from the mutineers outside. The ship's external structural integrity alarms began to wail in a pitch Lyra had never heard before. The alien anomaly had completely breached the dimensional threshold, and its first massive, shadowy tendril had just violently wrapped itself around the outer hull of the flagship. When the gods of a dead universe come knocking, they do not ask for permission to enter, they simply tear the door of reality completely off its hinges. The Solace Dominion had spent 5 centuries forging an unbroken blade to fight a war of annihilation. But the harsh truth of the cosmos is that you cannot stab an enemy constructed entirely of fundamental paradoxes. The flagship shuddered violently as the alien intelligence breached the upper stratosphere. The ruined viewport on the central bridge, before the amber emergency lights completely failed, had shown the sky physically peeling back. It was not merely a storm of chaotic energy. It was a swirling, nauseating vortex of impossible fractal geometry, revealing a predatory abyss that defied the natural laws of physics. The Emperor's massive planetary defense cannons, weapons that had casually leveled entire rebellious continents, finally unleashed their full fury upward. Pillars of concentrated thermal energy thicker than city blocks slammed into the descending anomaly. Thousands of Dominion starfighters swarmed from the lower hangars like a cloud of angry iron wasps, unleashing a torrent of synchronized, destructive power that could have easily vaporized a small moon. But the anomaly did not burn. It adapted. The massive, shadowy tendril wrapped around the hull of the dreadnought was not a physical limb. It was a dimensional conduit. The rift bled directly into the isolated atmosphere of the ship. The interior plasteel bulkheads warped and screamed as physical manifestations of the alien intelligence poured into the pristine corridors. They were shifting, jagged silhouettes of absolute darkness, entities that consumed ambient light and heat with an endless, starving gravity. The mutinous Imperial Council guards, who only moments ago had plotted a ruthless political coup, were systematically and effortlessly dismantled by creatures that completely ignored their heavy kinetic armor, turning elite soldiers into frozen, desiccated husks in mere seconds. Kalen forced the auxiliary command doors open, shoving Lyra forcefully ahead of him into the main arterial hallway. The localized gravity plating was beginning to fail, the entire ship groaning under the immense crushing pressure of the alien conduit. He knew the central bridge was entirely lost. Their only remaining tactical option was the primary engineering deck, where the Dreadnought's hyper-advanced singularity core powered the planetary orbital defense network. If the alien entities corrupted that specific core, the planetary shields would collapse instantly, and the billions of terrified citizens huddled in the dark metropolis below would be consumed by the cosmic tide. They breached the massive vaulted chamber of the engineering deck just as a flood of shadow creatures poured over the opposite catwalks. The sheer scale of the conflict was breathtaking and profoundly horrifying. In the center of the massive room hung a captured, artificial star, held in delicate magnetic suspension. Kalen charged forward into the glowing ambient light of the core, an avatar of pure mechanical fury. He fired his hand cannon until the barrel warped from the heat, then discarded the weapon, resorting entirely to his bare, titanium hands. He caught the plunging, jagged limbs of the shadow beast in midair, his hydraulic servos screaming in protest against the impossible, shifting physics of the enemy. He fought with a desperate, suicidal intensity, his reinforced armor absorbing glancing blows that flash-froze his synthetic hydraulic fluids. Every brutal strike he landed, every entity he shattered into dissipating ash, bought Lyra precious fleeting seconds. Lyra sprinted to the elevated central command dais, her mind hyper-focusing, completely blocking out the deafening roar of the battle behind her. The console was a chaotic, strobing mess of warning runes and rapidly failing power grids. She completely ignored the standard tactical displays and dug straight into the raw, foundational code of the Singularity Core. The brilliant, ruthless Imperial engineers had built a massive engine of unparalleled destruction, but they did not truly understand the quantum mechanics of the fire they were burning. Lyra did. She recognized the unique, chaotic energy signature of the alien intelligence instantly. It was the exact same multidimensional frequency she had mapped in her subterranean laboratory 500 years ago. She realized with cold, terrifying clarity that conventional weapons were entirely useless against an enemy that existed outside of linear time. She could not destroy the anomaly with sheer kinetic force. She had to invert its entry vector. A massive, hulking amalgamation of shadow and fractured metal tore through Kalen's defensive line. It bypassed the towering cyborg entirely, its predatory instincts locking onto the massive, pulsing energy output of the primary core situated directly behind Lyra. It lunged across the chasm, a sweeping wave of lethal sub-zero dark matter aimed straight for her unprotected back. Kalen did not attempt to calculate a firing trajectory. He threw his massive, heavily armored body directly into the path of the strike. The impact was entirely silent, but the resulting kinetic shockwave shattered the reinforced glass of the command dais and violently buckled the steel grating beneath their feet. The alien entity drove a condensed physical spike of pure shadow straight through Kalen's heavy chest plate. The dark matter bypassed his carbon fiber weaving entirely, cleanly piercing his hyper-compressed kinetic heart. The Emperor fell. His massive, indestructible frame hit the metal deck with a sickening, definitive weight that echoed above the hum of the dying core. The glowing crimson targeting lens replacing his left eye flickered wildly before dimming to a dull, lifeless gray. The heavy, relentless thumping that had sustained his brutal reign for 5 centuries abruptly and entirely ceased. But his ultimate sacrifice had shattered the creature's physical manifestation, buying Lyra the final, crucial window she desperately needed. Tears blurred her vision, but her hands never stopped moving across the holographic interface. She bypassed the hardwired safety limiters on the Singularity core, forcing the massive drive to swallow its own gravitational output. She had to calculate the exact spatial-temporal collapse frequency necessary to perfectly match the rift's aggressive expansion rate. A mathematical gamble of apocalyptic proportions. She rapidly inputted the complex dimensional shifting theorem she had theorized in her past life, rewriting the fundamental laws of physics within the core's magnetic containment field. The equations stabilized the heavily modified localized temporal field, locking the variables into place. Lyra slammed her palm against the primary execution rune. She did not fire a weapon. She fired a localized paradox. The dreadnought's massive singularity core detonated inward. A blinding, completely silent wave of inverted chronal energy expanded rapidly outward from the ship, rolling flawlessly over the descending alien tendrils and washing across the bleeding, torn sky. The effect was immediate, violent, and profoundly disorienting. The shadow creatures swarming the engineering deck instantly dissolved into harmless, static ash, their timeline forcefully rewritten into non-existence. Outside the massive viewport, the writhing cosmic entity was caught dead in the center of the temporal backwash. It was forcefully dragged backward, its impossible geometry folding in on itself. The inverted energy pushed the anomaly violently back through the jagged tear in reality, like watching a shattered pane of glass seamlessly reassemble itself in reverse. With a final blinding flash of pure, sterile white light that illuminated the entire dark hemisphere of the Solace Dominion, the dimensional membrane snapped firmly shut. The cosmic predator was gone, leaving behind nothing but the cold, silent, and entirely empty vacuum of normal space. The world was saved. The sky was healed. But the architect of that salvation was currently bleeding out on the cold steel floor of a dying warship, leaving a brilliant woman alone to face the terrifying prospect of inheriting a galaxy built entirely on his sins. The silence that follows a canceled apocalypse is never truly peaceful. It is merely the suffocating, heavy pause before the survivors are forced to tally the final cost of their salvation. The engineering deck of the flagship was a sprawling graveyard of twisted metal and static temporal ash. Lyra completely ignored the sparking consoles and the blaring rhythmic warning klaxons, dropping to her knees on the scarred steel floor beside the fallen giant. Kalen's immense cybernetic frame lay completely still, a dark, viscous synthetic fluid pooling rapidly beneath his shattered chest plate. The hyper-compressed kinetic pump that had driven his ruthless 500-year conquest across the stars was entirely silent. Lyra frantically tore at his reinforced carbon fiber plating, her brilliant analytical mind desperately searching for a mechanical failsafe, a hidden emergency bypass, or any conceivable method to restart his massive artificial heart. She was a woman who had just rewritten the fundamental laws of multidimensional physics, Yet she was entirely powerless to mend a broken man. Kalen reached up. His movements were terrifyingly slow, completely stripped of the flawless hydraulic speed of the unstoppable Emperor. His heavy metallic fingers gently caught her trembling hands, pulling them away from his ruined armor. His biological eye, the single agonizing remnant of the quiet security guard from a dead century, looked up at her with a profound, shattering clarity. He did not ask about the alien entity bleeding through the rift. He did not ask about the operational status of the planetary defense grid or the treacherous schemes of the mutinous Imperial Council. He simply looked at the unblemished fabric of her stasis suit and the tear-streaked skin of her face. He told her, his synthetic voice reduced to a harsh, failing whisper that grated like grinding gears, that the complex mathematical equation of his life was finally balanced. He had spent half a millennium turning himself into a planetary monster, drowning an entire solar system in blood, and crushing the inherent freedom of humanity solely to ensure the universe remained habitable for its brightest mind. Lyra pressed her forehead against his cold, ruined shoulder. She wept openly, entirely abandoning the stoic, highly logical facade of the old Republic scientist. She fiercely told him that a universe purchased with the total destruction of his soul was entirely too expensive. She pleaded with him to stay, demanding that he help her dismantle the vast nightmare he had built, begging him to finally see the sunlight he had fought so ruthlessly and tirelessly to preserve. A faint, rusty vibration rattled deep within his chest. It took Lyra a moment to recognize the sound as a genuine, exhausted laugh. He explained with a dark and heartbreaking wisdom that a heavy iron sword forged exclusively for slaughter cannot simply be used to harvest grain. He was the definitive villain of human history, a necessary, brutal evil constructed for a singular apocalyptic purpose, and his purpose was flawlessly fulfilled. He confessed a truth that carried the terrifying weight of a profound moral lesson. Love is rarely the gentle, warm light depicted in ancient poetry. In the unforgiving dark, absolute devotion is a terrifying, world-altering force. It can easily burn down entire galaxies just to keep a single, fragile ember warm. He looked at her one last time, his hazel eye softening into an expression of absolute, perfect peace. He whispered softly that his long shift was finally over. He closed his eye. The faint blue luminescence of his heavy respirator flickered twice and faded to dead black. The architect of the Iron Peace, the tyrant who had held humanity hostage to save it from the predatory stars, simply stopped breathing. Lyra knelt in the quiet dark for a long time. The tragedy of their existence washed over her, a crushing wave of grief tangled with a terrifying realization. Kalen had successfully handed her a saved world, but he had securely wrapped it in unbreakable titanium chains. Heavy, synchronized footsteps suddenly echoed from the main arterial corridor. A massive battalion of the Emperor's elite obsidian guards marched onto the ruined engineering deck. They were battered, their armor deeply scorched from the brief, violent clash with the temporal anomalies, but their military discipline remained absolute. At their head was Commander Kale, the highest-ranking loyalist officer on the dreadnought. He stopped at the edge of the shattered dais, looking down at the lifeless body of the invincible, terrifying god he had served his entire life. Then, the veteran commander looked at the fragile biological woman kneeling in the tyrant's blood. He saw the brilliant mind who had just wielded a localized singularity to rewrite the fabric of the cosmos and push a nightmare back into the dark. Lyra stood up. She did not wipe the tears from her face, nor did she attempt to hide her profound grief. She squared her shoulders, summoning the absolute unyielding authority of a woman who had just stared down an apex predator from another dimension. Her idealistic political theories clashed violently with the gritty reality of the present. She knew with terrifying mathematical certainty that simply declaring the Solus Dominion completely dissolved would immediately plunge the surviving human worlds into a catastrophic, bloody civil war. The Imperial Council was still waiting in the subterranean war rooms below, sharpening their knives, entirely ready to tear the Empire apart for scraps and plunge the working classes into immediate anarchy. She could not instantly break the massive sword Kaelin had forged. She had to wield it, gripping the bloody hilt just long enough to force a broken society to forge a true republic. She looked directly at the Loyalist commander. She ordered him to secure the dreadnought, ruthlessly purge the remaining mutineers from the lower transit decks, and set an immediate, hyper-velocity course for the capital city. She stated coldly, her voice echoing in the vast chamber, that the Imperial Council required a harsh, immediate lesson in loyalty. The empty, imposing throne in the central citadel was about to be occupied by someone who actually understood the terrifying mathematics of consequence. The commander did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. He slammed his heavy armored fist against his breastplate and dropped heavily to one knee, bowing his head in absolute submission to the new Empress of the Solus Dominion. The rest of the massive battalion instantly followed suit, a terrifying wave of black steel bending willingly to the will of a woman from the old Republic. Lyra turned her back on the kneeling soldiers and looked out the massive, shattered viewport. The bleeding anomaly was entirely gone. The sky above the world was perfectly clear, filled with the cold, pristine light of 1,000,000 untouched stars. The dark age of the tyrant was officially over, but the slow, agonizing, and highly dangerous work of building the new dawn had just begun. Thank you so much for watching this incredible journey. If you found yourself captivated by the tragic romance of Kaelin and Lyra, and the profound moral questions regarding the delicate balance between survival and power, please make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with a friend who deeply appreciates gritty, thought-provoking science fiction. Drop down into the comments section right now and leave the word devotion so I know you made it to the very end of the story. Do not forget to hit that hype button below the video so the algorithm pushes this narrative out to more sci-fi fans just like you. I will see you in the next universe.